In this video, which is titled How to Shaders, we learn how to approach creating some of the fundamental shaders, including plastic, parquet or wood generally, concrete, and metal. Let's start with plastics. I'm going to create a new standard surface shader, rename it to plastic, assign it to the shader ball, and run the IPR. And let's open up the shader itself. For plastic shaders, base color is the most important component and contributes the most to the final look. Let's use this yellowish orange color with the RGB values of 252, 190, and 10. And set the base weight to 1. Now coming down to the specular section, I mentioned in the specular lesson that for most materials and shaders, you can safely keep the specular weight and color at 1 and white to keep the shader as physically accurate as possible. In the past, we used to control specular weight and specular color and roughness and then define very specific IR values for each shader. Just forget that. In this new approach, specular weight is almost always 1. Specular color is just a simple white color. And the IR value for most daily shaders like plastic, wood, concrete, and so on can be around 1.5. The only thing we are interested in is the specular roughness. We add variations to the specular roughness with a grayscale texture, and that adds all the realism we need. So add an image node and load this BW1 texture. I'm gonna set it as the beauty shader and set its scale U and V to 2. As this map will be connected to the specular roughness, I'm going to change the color space to utility raw because we are in ACES. I discussed ACES in the introduction section and it will be discussed thoroughly in the rendering section. If we connect this map to the specular roughness, as we learned before, those dark patches are gonna make the surface sharper at those areas. We want the opposite, so let's invert the image. A quick way to do it is going to be by using a complement or invert node. We want to add this node after the image node. A simple way to do so is that you can first select the node that you want the next node to be after, then press Ctrl Tab and search for the node you want it to be added after. In this case, it's complement. Now if you press Enter, it will automatically be added after that node. Now the image is inverted. And finally, let's add a RAM float node after the complement and connect the RAM float node to the specular roughness input and set the standard surface shader as the beauty shader. I use the RAM float node to be able to adjust the texture values. As soon as we add this variation to the specular roughness, now we get a much more realistic shader. The map is a bit too contrasty and I'm looking for something more subtle. So I'm going to select the darkest values using my RAM float node and increase them to something like 0.085. Now the sharper reflections become a bit rougher. Then I'm going to select the brightest values of my texture, which are responsible for these rough patches, and set them to around 0.5. Now they become sharper. So this is the map after the complement node, and this is it after we adjusted its values using the RAM float node. So using this RAM float node, we made the darker values a bit brighter to make the sharpest parts a bit rougher, and we also made the brighter parts quite darker to make the rougher parts much sharper, and that is the shader we get. In terms of importance of components for plastic shader or anything similar, now we need to work on the subsurface scattering. So open up the subsurface scattering section, set the weight to around 0.5, 0.6. Depending on the particular plastic, the SSS weight can be quite low or high. You need to look at your reference image and see if it has a lot of SSS or not, and then decide on the subsurface scattering weight. Set the radius to around 1 centimeters. For the color, I'm gonna copy the base color and paste it here as well. And this really adds quite a lot to the overall realism of the shader. It's beautiful. The next thing to consider is to work on the bump mapping. For most surfaces, you need an overall unevenness that can be achieved with a simple noise, and then more high frequency details, which you can just reuse the specular roughness map for it. Now let's add a bump to the node. Now, should we use the original map or the inverted version? If I set the complement shader as the beauty shader, we know that these white patches are making the specular reflections rougher and the dark patches are making the surface sharper. If we consider bump map, these white patches will add bump and dark patches will add indent. And that is what we want. So connect the complement to the bump map input of the bump 2D node, and bump 2D node to the normal input of the shader, and set the shader as the beauty shader. The bump amount is clearly too much. Let's try 0.05 centimeters. Still too much. Let's try 0.01. You know, bump mapping can be a bit tricky. So when I add bump mapping, I tend to scale up the render to see what is happening in the final render. So let me draw a region and set the scale to 200% in the IPR. Now you see even 0.01 centimeters is too much for a fairly smooth plastic surface. Let's reduce it to something like 0.002 centimeters. I think this is good. We don't want to exaggerate anything. Subtle and little is always better. So that's the high frequency details. Let's disable the region and set the scale back to 100%. Now let's quickly add that general unevenness to the surface using a noise node. Most of the materials and surfaces surrounding us in real life are not made perfectly. It's not going to be perfectly smooth. There is some sort of waviness to it. And if you take a look at any reflective surface around you, you can see that overall waviness and unevenness to them. So add a noise node, set it as the beauty shader, set its scale to around 13. Now connect it to a bump 2D node and connect the bump 2D node to the normal input of our main bump 2D node in the chain. Now, if I increase the bump height in the new bump 2D node to something like 5 centimeters, you can see that's the type of unevenness that I'm talking about, but we want it to be subtle here. So let's set the bump height to around 0.4 centimeters. Now let's see what we get. Now this is a pretty good plastic shader and you can call it a day. One other thing that you can add to your shader to make it more realistic is to make the perpendicular faces a bit sharper compared to the parallel faces to the viewing direction. We can do that simply using the coat section of the shader. We talked about this specific topic in the coating lesson. For now, let's set the coating weight to around 0.5 and coat IOR to around 1.2. So the coat will be limited to only the perpendicular faces, and decrease the roughness to 0.05. And this will add another level of realism to the overall shader. We can go ahead